So do you think pastors are just getting overwhelmed from the amount of brokenness around them, and then that's just pushing them over the edge?
Pastors are put up as these standard bearers, these perfect people we think they are, or we want them to be. And so therefore, that creates a certain isolation. Any of us left to ourselves, we're built for community.
Is there like a checkpoint, like, hey, at some point, like, hey, do we need to reevaluate the character at some point?
Whatever you did at the beginning, those things don't just start when you begin the ministry. 20 years later, you still need to be having transparency, accountability, vulnerability.
How did you learn what it means to be a good father?
Can't just wish you want to. I have to model that. I have to impart that. I have to live it myself, and that requires a lot of self-sacrifice. People talk about quality time, quantity time. It's actually both of those.
Okay.
You have to be there and be involved in your kids' lives.
Yeah.
From a quantity, from a time perspective, and back to what I said earlier,
Okay, well, we have my dad, Mr. Vincent Carpenter, in the studio today. Super excited to have you. This is the first episode of my Friends and Family segment of the Blueprint Podcast. And so for this season, this segment, I'm going to be bringing in like close friends, family, just so like my guests can get to hear just the quality of conversations I get to have in my personal life, and just get the people who are in my inner circle just to add value to my audience as well. So really excited about this, and excited for you to be one of the first ones to jump on. So yeah.
Thanks, son, for inviting me. I feel honored to be the first one, and just feel honored as your dad that you wanted me to be here. So
yeah, this is gonna be really good. So you're a great communicator, and so why don't you just kind of tell the people a little bit who you are? Who is Vincent Carpenter?
So I am a 20-year pastor. I've been a pastor at a church in Waco, Texas, over the last 2 decades, serving in a variety of capacities. I've been a community outreach pastor. I've been a small groups pastor. I've been an administrative, kind of a church administrator type role. And now I'm the director of Pastoral Care at my church. And so I get to serve people in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
So that's kind of primarily what I do. And along with that is some teaching and preaching. Our church plants other churches, so I get to move around our movement and help equip other churches as they grow and develop. I also do what we call kingdom culture at our church, which is kind of in ethnicity, race relations, how different people groups get along and serve the kingdom together. So those are some of the roles that I play.
Yeah, I love that. You got a lot going on.
Definitely, very much so.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's this is going to be a fun conversation, because this is like, as we're filming, this is a week after Father's Day. And so me and my brother drove into town to watch you preach today, and it was just really great. You gave a great sermon. And so you're also just a really good communicator as well. And so I think even just some of the ways I communicate on this podcast, I have learned from you just over the years of watching you communicate and be a pastor. And so giving you your flowers there really quick.
I appreciate that.
So we actually, our family got the honor of being front page of Anchor News, which is, if you're not familiar, is a Black-owned newspaper here in Waco. And she did the owner, she did a segment on fatherhood and for Father's Day. And so our family got a highlight on the front page. So that was really cool. So like, what did you think about being on the front page of a newspaper and kind of just seeing our family highlighted?
I felt very humbled. I mean, when my wife Tanya and I started our family, we wanted to invest in you and your brother and your sisters in a way that y'all would be influencers, that y'all would contribute to society in a meaningful, significant way. And so kind of seeing you and your brother on the front page of me kind of feel like, wow, maybe we actually did that. So sometimes as a parent, you kind of wonder, have I done any good? Have I done more damage? Have I made more positive contributions that I have made mistakes? So sometimes you go back and forth in your mind wondering about those kinds of things. But over the course of my life, I've gotten windows in that think, oh, wow, maybe God did use us. Maybe we've had an impact, because I'm seeing you and your brother and your other siblings starting to make impacts in other people's lives. And so that newspaper article was just kind of one evidence of that.
I love that. Yeah, that's right on. I mean, I think about just even my worldview and what I want to do with my life. It makes sense that you guys from a young age y'all were kind of molding us to be those kind of people. So naturally, one of my biggest values is like, what impact did I make on the world? Right? That's what guides my life. Like, hey, is what I'm doing gonna make an impact on other people? And if it's not, then I'm always trying to find, how do I get back? So that's part of the value system that even is behind at the foundation of this podcast, right? Is being able to help people grow their faith community and their business, and being able to find community members and connect them to people who need their resources and their answers and the questions people we're looking for. And so, just even you're living in literally getting to participate in kind of part of your life's work. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So how would you describe what it means to be a good father? Because obviously we're kind of giving you your kudos here in this episode. Hey, you did a great job. You're now sitting on the podcast, getting to see, me live out how you've molded me to be. A lot of people would say, hey, you've done a great job with that, right? Okay. So how would you describe what it means to be a good father from your own perspective?
I would say being a great father means giving up your life to give life to other people. Mm-hmm. Okay, we just talked about, hey, it was my wife and I's goal to see y'all become community contributors. Mm-hmm. So in order for that to happen, we've got to invest our lives into your lives. So that which we have, we give to you, so then you give that away to others.
Yeah.
That sounds good, and it sounds admirable. Life experience, however, has said, that requires giving up your life. Mm-hmm. You to impart something that's going to be meaningful to another person requires a lot of you. Mm-hmm. I think you may remember I would say, hey, I want you guys to hang out with the right kind of people. Mm-hmm. And maybe you remember this, I would say if I need to give up my Saturday afternoon nap, because being a pastor, you work a lot of hours. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I cherish was being able to get a nap on Saturday afternoon. Yeah. But I said I would be willing to give that up if I need to drive y'all to a friend's house and take you to be around somebody that's going to be a positive influence. And so that's a simple illustration, but that had to be repeated numerous times in numerous different ways in order to make a contribution. Yeah. I can't just wish that you become something with your life. I can't just wish you want to. I have to model that. Mm-hmm. I have to impart that. I have to live it myself, and that requires a lot of self-sacrifice. And so being a father is one who will sacrifice to give life to another.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, we went to lunch before this episode, and we're kind of talking about family and, past experience and past traumas. And how did you learn what it means to be a good father? Because obviously you had a great father, grandfather were good people. Obviously they had their challenges though, right? Sure, and there was things that, as a child you had to kind of work through. So I think there's been this historical narrative around black men and fatherhood that like black men are just absent fathers, right? And I think some of that is true. I think some of that is narratives that were meant to suppress black men, and so I don't think that's all the way the truth. I think it's not the full picture. But for a lot of people, we have had trauma with our fathers. So how did you learn this perspective of fatherhood, even though at times you didn't necessarily see it portrayed in the best way growing up?
Right. Yeah. As you said, I've experienced some challenges in my own upbringing with my father. However, one of the positives, one of the contributions he made to me, my father was present. And so I know a lot of people in our society don't have that, but I did have a present father. I can remember he worked a lot of hours, and I just grew up. He drove a dual exhaust truck. And back then in the 70s, that was kind of not the norm. Most people had single exhausts. So you would always hear his truck crank up, and then you'd hear it drive down, and you'd hear the so and everybody knew that. So I grew up hearing him get up and go to work. I would hear him come home. So he was present. He was consistent in my life. Though there were challenges, that did breed some consistency. And I do think I adopted that from him. I think maybe one of the things I may have contributed to y'all's life was a sense of consistency. I was there. I was present. So being present is a huge part of being a good father. Being there and being available. People talk about quality time, quantity time. It's actually both of those. Okay. You have to be there and be involved in your kids' lives. Yeah. From a time perspective. And back to what I said earlier, the quality is the willingness to lay the life down. That means you're having the conversations, you're giving the dialogues, you're expressing patience. You're not just lecturing, but you're also hearing what's going on in the heart of your kids. So. Yeah,
that's good. And I think the standard is raising even for what it means to be a man and to be a father, right? Because we're starting to see a more positive narrative. There's a group that I work with called Cool Dad that is really kind of help change the narrative of fatherhood. So there's a lot of really great like organizations and social media accounts and media that's really kind of start to show specifically black men being present in their kids' lives. And I think what you mentioned earlier in terms of that sacrificial piece, I think being present is now that's the standard. That's the bottom. Okay, now that you're present, now what do you do with the time that you're there? And so that's what you've kind of mentioned. That's what being a father is being present, but then to be a good father means being sacrificial, being able to like lead your family, understand that you have values that you want to incorporate into your kids. And so I think those are things that I want to have more conversations around, and helping men go from just being present to, hey, here's a father that raises kids that can now change the world, right? Who can do those same things. That's kind of the next phase. And we want that to now be part of the narrative from a media standpoint, because I think that's happening behind the scenes, and that's not always on the camera. And like a lot of that molding and stuff isn't necessarily things that are camera worthy, right? The hardness of being a parent isn't always like, hey, let's make a podcast and show how to be a good father. It's not always that easy. But I think we need to have more conversations about it so people can start being more comfortable and being able to ask questions and find other people that can help you based on kind of the narrative that's out there. So that's why I think this episode particularly, I think is going to be really helpful for some people. What words would you use to describe our family legacy in terms of just the Carpenter family? What are some words that describe us, right? Because obviously we just got our flowers and being front page. And so there's some things that the world is looking at us and being like, hey, that family's doing it the right way. Let's promote them. So what words did you use to describe just our family unit?
Yeah, I would say goal-oriented would be one of those. When I started my journey, you made reference to my father. I started out, I don't want to make the mistakes I saw him make. Okay, and that was a start for me. But I learned, that ain't actually what I really wanted. I learned that actually it's something bigger. Because if you kind of I don't want to do what my parents did, or I want to do better, really that's a little bit of a judgment in that. And so that doesn't actually end up producing a lot. What I have learned over the years is that, actually we want to call ourselves to something higher. My faith is a part of that. The desire to make a contribution to society is a part of that. And so I would say that's one of the things our family has done. We've had goals. Start out athletically. Most of us participate in some kind of sports or some kind of school activities, having education. All of us have attained to higher education. And so having a goal, reaching towards something is a word that would describe our family.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so goal-oriented, having something to go after. I love that. I think what I would add to it is from your particular element, what you brought to our family is grace. And I think we've called you like the guardian of grace. And like those are like different things that we've said is like, our family has had challenges too. Like we're not a perfect family, but I think the thing that defines all of us is the ability to hold space for hard conversations. I think we're very comfortable communicating how we feel from the positive side and negative side of things. And so one thing that we've always done for birthdays and big moments in our lives, we've done like encouragement times, right? Where we're like very verbally affirmations. And as I've gone out into the world, I realized that most of the society is not comfortable with that, right? And so I'm always trying to do that at my friends' parties or my wife's parties or whatever. And people are like, yo, this is weird. Like, and I think a lot of people show love in their own ways. And this is just our family. But I think it's so powerful because the way we show love and how we're encouraging to people and we're gracious toward people, I think it creates a space of freedom for other people. I think people can just naturally be themselves, which I think is present in like watching you preach today. Like you preach very authentically, and it's not a really performance at all. It's just like, hey, you preach with passion, but it's like authentic, and you tell stories that are authentic, and like I think people get a sense I think people know our family very well just from the stories that you tell. Good stories and bad stories and challenging stories, right? And so I think that's like really important in terms of what I think defines our family, that authenticity, that grace, and that allows other people to just relax and be like, okay, I can be real too. Right? Okay, the Carpenters are great, but they don't have it all together, and we don't have it all together. Our family, and I think that grace. I think that's why people really gravitate toward how you communicate. So that's something I even want to get better at with this podcast. Is how can we make this a more authentic experience so that people can really just like see themselves in it and not just be like, oh my God, look at this person on stage or this person in front of me on the camera, but like, okay, I can be a part of that too. So, so let's switch gears a little bit. Okay. So, you've dedicated like almost your whole life to ministry, to church. And, unfortunately, there are a lot of pastors that occupy a similar space that you do who have just fallen recently, right? You think of the Tony Evans, the Brian Houstons, the Carl Lentzes of the world who I just feel like every day you're turning on the TV and there's like some pastor who's in some kind of scandal, right? I Googled Houston pastor scandal, and there was a bunch of pastors that I didn't even know. There's just like so much brokenness, just like pastors stealing from people, pastors, molesting people. It's just like the list just goes long. And so like, what is wrong with pastors these days? Like, I mean, like, why are all these pastors falling? Is this just indicative of the news is now picking it up and it's always been that way? Or you think there's something that's happening right now that's really causing pastors to just fall in terms of integrity and the standard?
Yeah, I think it's a little both and of what you just said. Obviously, with the increase of social media and technology, we obviously hear so much more. So obviously, these things, unfortunately, have already been happening. And now because of the influence of technology, social media, as I said, we hear a lot more about it. And the social dynamics of our society are shifting for a variety of reasons. So there is a lot more inner struggle that I've seen. I'm seeing that as a pastor. The types of things that I'm counseling people over now is way different than when I started at the current church I'm at in 2005. The intensity of people's struggles.
Like, what are some of those struggles?
A lot of it has to do, I talk a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of gender confusion. When I started in my current church that I'm at now, your mom used to help me some, and we would just help couples, for example, with basic communication skills. Now, much of the time when I sit down with a couple, it's not about communication. They're now deciding whether they are even going to stay married or not. And so it's kind of like, wow, they went from, hey, we have a little bit of a trouble talking to each other, like, well, we ain't even committed to stay together. So most times I'm trying to figure out, help them decide if they're going to even continue their marriage. And so there's been a high increase of isolation that people experience. People seem to be much more having high boundaries, even within family systems. A lot more, like say, isolation would be one of the bigger things I see a lot of, and I think a lot of the other issues spawn from that.
Okay, so do you think pastors are just getting overwhelmed from the amount of brokenness around them, and then that's just pushing them over the edge, or kind of why are we seeing these pastors fall into this, like, you know, prominent pastors really? And I think Carl Lentz, for example, was such an influential figure, and I think it really shook a lot of people's faith, right? Even just seeing him fall, right? So, and then just even the Brian Houstons, the Hillsongs, I mean, just like the people who defined over the past 2 decades have defined what the Western church, right? So, like, I mean, what is it that you, in your opinion, is causing that?
Well, there's a lot of factors. I think one of the big things, like I said, isolation, that's a cultural dynamic that's happening. And it didn't just start. I mean, a lot of times you could say, oh, that started with COVID. And COVID was an accelerator of that. But that dynamic was already functioning, and I think it was functioning a lot in pastors because pastors, unfortunately, right or wrong, get put on pedestals. Either they do it themselves or expectations of their people, pastors are put up as these standard bearers, these perfect people we think they are or we want them to be. And so therefore that creates a certain isolation. If I have it all together, like you have referred to our family not having it all together, that makes you relatable. Okay, but if people think you're perfect, you have it all together, though they might respect that, they actually distance themselves from that. And so what happens is if your congregation is distancing themselves from you, then you're in isolation. And you feel the pressure. They think you're perfect. They think you have it all together. And so you have this pressure internally to produce that. And so therefore, if you start having a struggle, well, I don't want nobody to see this. They think I'm perfect. That compounds the isolation. So what happens is anybody in isolation can fall into some type of struggle, some type of misjudgment, or let's just say fall into sin. So a big, huge part of this is pastors being isolated. Any of us left to ourselves, we're built for community. We are made to be with each other. That's why the scripture says God puts the lonely in families. That means we're created to be in communal situations. Anybody get out of that, you're destined for trouble.
And I mean, it was interesting to me is typically there is some kind of pastoral oversight, right? There's typically a pastor isn't the top of the totem pole, right? There's like an advisory committee, a board of directors. Do you think like the Brian Houstons of the world probably could almost supersede that in terms of just their aura, right? Do you think that is not, those oversight committees aren't strong enough or aren't built in a way to be able to be that community for pastors? Or like, what do you think the problem is there? Or is it like, hey, they just get too big and like nobody can tell them anything?
It's an advisory board has a function, but it can't be the whole thing. So advisory boards, I serve on advisory boards for churches. And so therefore, advisory boards' primary contribution is to give wisdom and guidance. Basically, you help the pastor or the senior leaders problem solve and give them perspective. However, they cannot provide the accountability and the community that people need, because I'm the advisory board of a church in New Orleans and one in Norman, Oklahoma. So I'm not living there. I'm not around those senior pastors. I don't see if they're making bad choices on a personal level, how they're interacting with their families. I'm just coming in for board meetings, and so my best contribution is my experience that can help him problem solve.
That makes sense.
What needs to happen is you still need an advisory board. In addition to that, pastor has to be in some kind of community. For example, at our church, we have small groups. We call them life groups.
Right.
And so we want every member of the church to be in a life group. Well, I, as a pastoral staff, I'm an elder at my church. I've been there for 20 years. I'm in a life group. I need to be in a small group of people getting prayed for, sharing when I'm having struggles, people seeing how I interact with my wife, seeing how I interact with my people need to see that in me, just like the average church member. But what can happen sometimes is, okay, I've been here 20 years, I've been there, done that. And I could excuse myself from that, thinking that I don't need that. That would be a mistake. And so, unfortunately, I think those types of things happen in churches. So.
Yeah, I was a college pastor for a few years after I graduated from college. And I experienced everything you're just talking about in terms of the community aspect, because I tried to be like the perfect example role model for the kids that were in my college group. And toward the end of my season, the feedback I got from them, they were like, hey, we just wanted to see you be you, right? They weren't necessarily looking for me, they weren't looking for like that perfect role model, right? And I think the unique situation for me was I went into ministry at a really early age, right out of college. So sometimes they even saw me more so as a peer than as an authority figure. So that was unique to that situation that I was in. I don't know that every situation is like that. I don't necessarily know that it was wise for me to be in a position of leadership. I think for the season I was in, I think it was good. I think God used me. But I didn't even notice, like, hey, I need community, right? Like, hey, even as the college pastor, I need to be around other people my age so that I can be upheld myself. But then also, hey, I need to be transparently be who I need to be for even the students that are watching me and I'm influencing. And so I think, I think I felt that even from my own experience, right? Totally. And so I'm thankful that that I wasn't on a world stage learning that, right? I was at a small church. I think my college group got up to maybe 25 people. It was the largest, you know what I mean? So anonymity almost kind of protected me, right? But if I was in front of 25,000 people and on a massive stage, like who knows what even some of the mistakes I made could have been compounded, right? And led into even darker, and just even what you're exposed to and the kind of sin that you get exposed to, I think is different at a larger level. So yeah, I think so. With that, do you think, you're a pastor at a mega church? Do you think the concept of a megachurch is healthy for the modern day pastor, or do you think that like we should be trying in some way to not necessarily get rid of megachurches, but just maybe reformat them? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, biblically, you have big and small churches. Now, you don't see the term megachurch in the scripture, but the church at Rome would be considered in that time frame a megachurch. Rome, it was located in a seaport city, kind of like a Houston, for example. Lots of people coming in, lots of people going. That early first century church in Rome was a big church. There were a lot of people. That probably has something to do with why in Acts it talks about they met in the temple and they met house to house, because obviously in a big, huge corporate setting where you've got thousands of people, you can't get community. You can't get transparency. You can't get somebody really knows what's going on in your life. That's why you need also what they call then the house to house, or we call those small groups, cell groups, life groups, all those types of things. You need both and. So I don't know that it's necessarily a mega church problem, because big churches and small churches both have challenges. Big churches have more resources. They can do more kingdom initiatives. But then sometimes you lose the senior pastor, for example, can become more isolated or that type of thing. Within in the small church, you have a lot depth of community within the situation. But then a lot of times there's not the resources, the vision, all those types of things that sometimes get people mobilized in the ministry. So you need them both. I just think that we have to, any situation, any bigger church, senior pastor and senior leadership have to be committed to the values of that church. And so the leaders need to be living out the same values that they're asking of the members. If there becomes a dichotomy in any way, therein lies a recipe for trouble.
Okay, gotcha. Is the concept of a head pastor biblical? And I can't think of a specific scripture where it talks about like somebody that's like that was like at the head of a large you know what I mean? Even the Roman church, like was there one person that's like, hey, I'm in charge of the, you know what I mean? Like, do you think that's a biblical concept, or is that like something that our culture has adapted? Obviously, I know there's leaders in the Bible, right? You think of the Pauls and, you know, the apostles. You know, those guys were more, you know, over the whole movement. You know what I mean? You think about like the Martin Luther Kings of the world would have been our equivalent to Paul, right? In terms of somebody who led a large movement. Yeah. But like in terms of like, okay, is having a head pastor over, you know, do you think that's biblical? And like, where do we see that?
Yeah, well, Jesus asked Peter, he said, you're going to be called the rock. He changed his name from Simon to Peter, meaning you're the rock. Most biblical scholars would tell you he was given a mantle of leadership of the first century church. Okay. So therefore, people would kind of put in modern context, he was kind of the senior pastor, if you will, of the modern church. Okay. And so most of what you see scripturally, though, if you look through Acts, Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, most of those first century churches, they had some kind of leadership. And in Paul's letters, he makes references to them. And sometimes there was groups of people, and sometimes there was there was couples that were leading. So I would say that a single person leading, probably that I would call that biblical. However, the wisdom is, though, that person is submitted to some kind of a team. It's never either or in most of these cases. In life in general, I've learned over years of ministry, it's both and. So yes, you need a senior leader. There has to be someone that's kind of calling the people toward what they feel like God is leading toward, but that needs to be done in the context of community. So either or without the other is not going to be effective.
Okay, got you. And I think you mentioned accountability earlier, and I think even some of the letters that Paul was acting as an accountability person, right? Some of those letters were kind of spicy, right? He was like getting on to people who were out of line, right? So you even think about the submission of those leaders to like Paul's leadership, right? And so there's never like the top, right? There should always be like a circle, right? There's always a level of accountability around that. Are there any prerequisites to being a ministry leader that aren't obvious? Like maybe to your life, were there any things that you felt like you did that set you up to have the place of authority that you have within your church at any point? I mean, you've served at multiple different churches and had leadership roles in all of those. So like, were there any steps that you feel like you had to take before you were eligible or
I get that.
It was appropriate for you to be there?
Yep, I totally get that. Well, in Timothy, it talks about the qualifications of an elder, basically referring to a leader, whether you want to say that's a senior leader or someone who has influence with other people. And it primarily talks about competence and character. Character first. So it talks about, if the person is married, if it talks about how that person's children are behaved, that kind of thing. So basically it wants to know, it's not about are your kids perfect, and it's not about saying do you have a perfect marriage. What it's really looking at is who you appear to be on Sunday morning. Is that who you are at home? Okay, so that it's talking about your internal characteristics, not asking for perfection, but asking for a sense of wholeness is what I like to think of, or consistency. Who you look like in private and public are the same. So that's the character piece. And it does talk about competency too, and it talks about it in the context of spiritual gifts. And all believers are imparted with certain gifts, and certain people have gifts for leadership. Certain people have gifts for teaching. Everybody is gifted in some way. And so the Holy Spirit gifts us all, so it's looking for the giftedness, and it's looking for the character, the inner core of the person. Is there a consistency? Okay, that's good. And I think, do you think is the character piece, like, I guess, how do you continue to measure that character piece? Do you think about like Tony Evans, for example, like had character to have stayed in the leadership as long as he's, so there's always some character sustaining that. But then there was like at some point the character broke down, right? So like, is there like a checkpoint? Like, hey, at some point, like, hey, do we need to reevaluate the character at some point? Or like, how do you continue? If you check those boxes initially, but then later on it's not there, I guess, how would you say like churches should be holding their people accountable in terms? Was that kind of, you already answered that in terms of the community piece of it? Well, you said it. Needs to be a consistency. There needs to be, whatever you did at the beginning. If character and competence was a requirement at the beginning, it can't change because you've been there a long time. If vulnerability, transparency, accountability, those things don't just start when you begin the ministry. 20 years later, you still need to be having transparency, accountability, vulnerability. And at 35, however long, that has to keep going.
Right.
Because at any point, you know, we all are vulnerable to stumble. We're all vulnerable to misjudgment. We're all vulnerable to sin.
Yeah.
So you have to keep doing the same things. We say a lot in marriage. We tell husbands, whatever you did to pursue your wife, you got to keep doing that. Yeah. You don't just tell her you love her when you're dating her, and you got to keep saying it every day. You got to keep bringing flowers. You got to keep encouraging. Whatever you did, you got to keep doing those things.
Okay.
And so I think that's what happens. It's easy for any of us to become complacent, feel like, okay, I've accomplished that, kind of take a breath, slack off, and we have an enemy.
Yeah.
And the enemy is waiting for an opportune time, and that's an opportune time. You see that in the life of David. He was a great warrior. And then he decided one season, it says when they went off to war, he stayed at home. He slacked off. He felt, oh, I've been there, done that. I don't need to now. And when he did that, he fell into sin.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the principle that we can look at.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, so let's kind of switch back to kind of your own story and your own purpose, mission, how you're doing ministry. Kind of in this season, was this like your third decade in ministry?
Yeah, so this is, I've been, this will be 20 years at the church I'm in now. And I was another pastor, lay pastor for 15 years, so this is my 35th year.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I guess how has your ministry or your purpose changed in this current season? Like, is there something you're focusing on now that maybe you weren't focusing on before, or that just kind of like, hey, like what are you trying to accomplish now?
I say the call has stayed consistent in some ways throughout my tenure. And that is, one, I feel called to be a servant leader. I've played lots of different roles, but in every role, there's been a core conviction that I lead people by serving them. Okay, there's all kind of leaders. All churches have what's called a visionary leader. That's typically the upfront person motivating the people towards something. I tend to be the person that is coming underneath people, serving them, helping them, whether that's a practical need like benevolence, or that's a discipleship need, helping them grow in their faith, or that's counseling, helping them work through problems, whatever it is. I tend to function in coming underneath, coming alongside other leaders in the church and the people of the church. I've done that in every role. That has always stayed the same. Okay, now sometimes my assignments have changed. Okay, so now at this season of my life, though I don't have the official title of it, I have an unofficial title. I'm kind of more a father of our church in a sense. I'm not the father, not the senior pastor, but a lot of the younger pastors kind of come to me. So I consistently get knocks on my doors by other newer pastors. I'm consistently talking to them, I'm sharing my experiences. So I'm mentoring pastors now. Okay. So that's a new season for me. It started a couple of years ago. I would just have younger men just start asking for my time. Okay, right now I spend time with a young, probably up and coming minister. Actually, the young man's parents actually approached me and just say, "Hey, would you spend some time with him?" Yeah, I've had other young men just come to me and want to spend time with me. Okay, and it just kind of developed naturally. Yeah, and so therefore I'm investing in the next generation. That's the phraseology we use at our church. Yeah, our church is 25 years old. And so now we have a lot of younger people. We've had people that's been around a while, and we're saying, hey, we need to invest in the next generation. So that's kind of a newer part of my assignment. Yeah, so
I love that. Yeah, and I think that's, you said earlier, at the verse in Timothy, basically you judge the character based off of family, right? So, I mean, you can just even look at, me and my brother kind of occupying that space with you in the news in the newspaper article, and just kind of them being able to see like how we have kind of modeled some of the things. So in terms of like discipleship, you can say, okay, look, Vincent's two oldest kids are doing the thing. So there's like, okay, now it only makes sense that people kind of see that and like, okay, well, yeah, he can talk to my kid too, right? He can talk to my son or my daughter too. So I think I just love being able to see just from a practical standpoint how that plays out. Right? Very much so. So yeah, is there anything else that you want to say about fatherhood, pastoralness? Pastoralness is
sure, I get that. Yeah, I would say on fatherhood, another big thing is humility. I've tried to practice over the years, always coming to you guys and saying, hey, give dad feedback. Okay, so now I'm a little bit old school, so let me qualify the statement I'm about to make, but you probably remember, I would say, hey, y'all can tell dad anything, and you won't get a whooping for that. Okay, so now I know spanking is not everybody's, that's not the direction everybody goes. Now I understand the context of all that, but you grew up in an old school type family.
Yeah.
But you knew when I said that, then you could say anything you wanted.
Yeah.
And I remember times y'all gave Dad feedback on how he was parenting, and that helped me.
Yeah.
And I would really encourage fathers to be humble and not only direct your kids, but it's also important to hear from them. Okay, so I've tried to do that. Even now that y'all are all grown, I've still practiced some of that, getting feedback from y'all, and so that's important. I think in that arena, in the pastoral arena, I think that there's always opportunity for us to continue to take risk. So we had a good discussion about pastors falling.
Yeah.
So maybe a part of that too can be we can become complacent. We've been there, we've done that, we've had some success, and we rest in that.
Yeah.
But there's always new adventures. There's always new hills to climb. There's always more that God's called us to.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we have to continue to pursue the call of God. And so God can bring us to new areas. And what that does is when God calls me to new areas, that shows my need for him. So like now another area of ministry for me as an agenda at our church, we call kingdom culture. Therefore, I'm trying to see people of all ethnicities come together and worship Jesus together. Different cultures, different races, different ethnicities bring lots of cultural, political, and social baggage, if you will, to a space. And so therefore, it's very challenging to do that. And so now I'm moving into this new area of work, and man, it has some challenges. But the challenges, though can be disconcerting at times, it also drives me closer to God because I can't do it without him.
Yeah.
So if I'm pursuing God with new intensity, I don't have room to be struggling. I don't have room to be falling into sin over here because I got new hills to climb. So I would say I would encourage pastors, don't rest on your laurels. We don't want to get resting on that newspaper clip we got the other day.
Right.
We need to be pursuing new things. And so not that we're doing it to get accolades or anything, but we want to be pursuing new goals so that we stay sharp and we stay connected to the one who's called us in the first place.
Yeah, that's so good. You're kind of creating almost, not necessarily creating more work for yourself, but just continuing to grow and evolve, not get complacent. And because I think, there's a lot of pastors that I think just become career pastors. They've been a pastor for 50, 60 years, right? And it's, similar to like the career politician. Right, where it's okay, you've been doing this for a long time. Like, how do you continue to be relevant, right? How do you continue to bring value and not just kind of find what works and kind of stick to it? And I see a lot of pastors that just their whole goal is just grow the church and get a bigger building, right? It's all about just growth, right? But it's like, okay, well, how can you shift culture? How can you become more relevant? How can you, how can you know when your season might be over? One of my favorite pastors, Mike Todd, tells a story of how he was the college pastor and basically became very apparent that the church was kind of growing toward him, right? Oh, okay. And they had a 5-year plan for him to become the senior pastor. But at year 3, the lead pastor realized, hey, this is Mike's church, right? And so he early transitioned the church over, right? And I think that's such a great example of a pastor understanding, hey, this is my season for this particular thing is over and I need to go into a different season. Yeah. So kind of knowing when to transition as well is also really important and not just kind of getting stuck in just doing the thing that works, right? And I think that's why a lot of times we just see, large churches that, you just look at them like, wow, you're a shell of what you used to be, right? Because I'm sure at some point something didn't change, right?
Yeah, something didn't change, right.
Yeah, so, man, this has been so good. We need to definitely do another episode. It's a lot of fun. I think I love when you talked about the mentorship aspect. I think there's a lot of young pastors that need mentorship, right? Especially young men, because I think a lot of men struggle with the cultural narrative of what it means to be a man, and a lot of that's getting wrapped up with even people in ministry, right? Running into, young ministers that just have ideology that is influenced by culture and not necessarily biblically. So I think we definitely need more people like you that are bringing wisdom to the narrative around fatherhood, around being a pastor. So hopefully we can have more conversations, more people can continue to be encouraged by you. And I thank you for taking the time. And it's been an honor. So thank y'all for watching the Blueprint Podcast. Feel free to check out some of the next episodes popping up on your screen. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot of my people that are watching my videos that keep coming back but just haven't subscribed. So what are you guys doing? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit a like. If you have any questions for my dad, about pastorhood, about fatherhood, drop those in the comments and we'll definitely answer those questions in future episodes. Thank you all for watching. See you next time.